everybody, welcome back to the texturing part of our tutorial. I am using Substance Painter 157 at that point, and the first thing that I want to do is create a new project. In here I will go ahead and select our low poly mesh, which we just exported earlier, and I also want to change the document resolution to 2K, which stands for our actual viewport display here, and can be changed later without any loss. So I will just go ahead and confirm that. And before I do anything else here, I will already go ahead and save that out here in our Substance folder where we have our low poly and our high poly files exported to keep it all in one place. I'm just going to go ahead and call that AKM here. And now we have an actual scene in here that we can work with, and the next step would be to actually bake our textures. And sliding that down here reveals that we have several map slots waiting to be filled here with baked texture information. But before we do that, I will add another channel here to our actual output textures. So I will select the ambient occlusion here and confirm that. And that means that these 5 channels are our actual final textures, which we are going to export later for Marmoset, or if you want to Unreal or any other game engine. And these here are just support maps that help us to achieve these textures here. So we'll go ahead and open the bake dialog. And the first thing worth mentioning about the bake dialog of Substance Painter is that it comes with common parameters, which means that all these parameters here only have to put in once, and they will automatically apply to all these different map channels here. So we only have to do that work once. First thing I want to do is actually select our OBJ, the high poly. And I will go ahead and change this here to maximum resolution 4K. And I will also switch the dilation to 16. That stands here for the edge padding basically, so we don't get any bleeding around our UV shells. And I will go ahead here and switch that over to 0.005. I already made a test bake earlier, so I know that these parameters work very well. And I want to uncheck average normals and put match to by mesh name. That will recognize our naming convention that we put earlier in max. And I will also want to put the anti-aliasing to 8x8. Now this covers all our common parameters here, but each one of these different maps here also comes with individual parameters, or at least some of them. The world space normal takes its information straight from the normal, so we don't have to do anything here. And as for our ID map, I want to change the individual parameters here over to mesh ID and to random. Now as for our ambient occlusion and our thickness map, those two are definitely going to take the longest time to render out. So I'm gonna uncheck them for now and bake them separately, and I will then later lower the anti-aliasing for these two. For now I will just go ahead here with the global settings applied to these 5 maps and see you as soon as it's done. And we are back with our first set of baked textures. As you can see, AO and thickness map are still missing, so I will just go straight back in here. And in the common parameters, I want to put the anti-aliasing to 2x2, which is perfectly fine for the AO and the thickness. And in our individual settings here, I want to put the secondary rays to 256, which will make it less grainy and just gives it a finer appearance in the actual AO texture. And I want to put the occluder distance to 0.001. Gonna copy that out here and also apply it later to the thickness. And for our self occlusion, I want to have it to same mesh name. So same thing here in the thickness. I want to put the self occlusion to only same mesh name. and I'm gonna copy 0.001 here in the occluder distance, and I want to put the secondary rays here also to 256. So with those settings here for AO and thickness only, I go ahead and bake that, and I'll see you as soon as it's done. And here we are again. Everything has been baked, and that is the perfect time to check our mesh if there are any errors on it, if the normal map looks fine. I already checked, so I know that everything is fine here, so I don't need to sweep through every little piece, but I would definitely recommend doing exactly that to make sure that we don't start texturing on a base that needs some improvement. As for things to do before we actually go ahead and start texturing or actually talk about a few features that Substance Painter comes with, we need to do one thing in particular here. We want to add that normal map pattern here onto the grip, and also here on the rear side we have a bit of this checker pattern normal map that we also want to apply. And fortunately I already have the right texture for that. I created it earlier with Quixel Suite Endo, and we can just use that. You will find that texture in the Essentials folder. If you are interested in how exactly it's done, you can find a tutorial here on Game Banana. So basically, if you search normal mapping diamond pattern in Google, you will find that tutorial, and it will guide you through all these steps to actually create that shape. And you can then also change the bevel amount and things like that if you want to have a bit of a different result. For now, I just want to go ahead here with this pattern in particular, and I'm gonna open it with Photoshop. Now the next thing that we need to do is actually bring our normal map of the AK into Photoshop so that we can overlay it here with our diamond normal map. And for that we have to go back to Substance Painter and export our textures. So I'm gonna just choose the right folder here. Gonna go to the AKM Substance folder, and I want to export it in the max resolution 4K, and I will just use the default config here for it. Gonna change it over to TJA, Targa, and go ahead, export that. And that went pretty fast. Open folder will then reveal that here are all our maps to choose from. And I'm gonna open it also here with Photoshop. And I will just grab our diamond texture here and drag it into that map here. And I can already see where our grip is here. And I will zoom in on that grip, make that whole thing full screen here. And I'm gonna change over to the path tool here, this one, and zoom in even more. I'm gonna take it right here at that corner, set the first path point. I'm gonna continue that over here and try to be as accurate as possible here. Just gonna follow these edges up to here and to that side. Fortunately, it's not a round shape, so it's not really very difficult. If you have a bit of a curve here, you can just keep the mouse button pressed and it will give you this curve here. So you can just do exactly that kind of action. If you press Alt, you only work with one of these things to point it in a certain direction. And I'm just going to connect it here, which means we have this path here as one. And then you can go over here to the path window or tab, select that path, and with Control and that button here, we have now a selection here of only that target area where we want the diamond normal map to apply. And I'm gonna over here back to the layers, and I'm gonna create a folder and select Add Layer Mask here. So now we have this thing here as an active folder with a mask, and we can just drag this pattern in there. And now I notice that this mask actually needs to be inverted. So I'll just select that mask here and press Ctrl and I. And now you see we have that pattern in here. And usually at that point, it's a good idea to have a look at some reference images to match it with our pattern that we have here. And this one reveals that our tiles here are still too big. And what I like to do in such a case is usually zoom in on the actual pattern of a reference image and count over here on the horizontal line. So in that case, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these diamond knobs. I'm just gonna grab that texture here. Usually I like to make a duplicate of it. Ctrl and J will do that. And unhide the first one for the case that we scale that down and we don't like it anymore and we always have a backup. So I'm just gonna go ahead here and press Ctrl and T. And with Shift and Alt, I will then scale it down until we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these guys here. And we already do. So it didn't really require a whole lot of work. Actually, let's just scale it down a little bit more here, around there. And I'm just going to confirm that with Enter and put it into the overlay mode. Now that was pretty simple here because our floater geometry that baked into our normal map already gave that shape away here where to put that diamond pattern. But now I also want to add it here to this element of the rear side. And for that we need to have our UV layout overlaying here onto that normal map. And I'm gonna jump back into 3D Max and open the UV editor here on our low poly mesh. And with text tools opened, we can change the size here to 4K, press wire, and that may take a few seconds. And then back in Photoshop, we can create a new folder, call it UVW, and just paste it in there. Now with this texture pasted in here, I'm just gonna put it to screen mode so that we actually see what's going on. And back in 3D Max, I'm gonna zoom in on that particular object that we want to identify. And we can already see it's right here. It's this piece, and I will then go over to Photoshop, zoom out, and now I know that it's that piece here. So I will go ahead here by creating an elliptical selection here. If you press Shift, it will make a uniform selection. So let's have it around this object here. And with the selection active, I'm just gonna create a new folder, and I will again here add a mask to it. And now Ctrl J on this texture here and drag it in there. And Ctrl T to actually select it so that we can grab it. I'm gonna bring it here over to that piece where we want to have it. Again, Shift and Alt to scale it down. And I want to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to have at least 6 of these pieces showing. So I'm going to scale it down even further. Looks about right. So I'm going to confirm that. And also it's already in overlay mode. That's okay. And that might almost qualify for a bit of an overkill here, but I also want to add it to the safety switch. And I want to have it specifically here on that element where I see this pattern is also present. So I want to have it both here on that side as well as the one at the bottom. And I'm just gonna jump back here in Max and identify it. It's this piece here and it's this one. Gonna go back in Photoshop and make a mask for exactly that. And I'm gonna zoom in here on that first piece and I will take the path tool for it. I'm just gonna make a selection here around this area where we want it. And back into this path tab here, I'm just gonna control and click on that path. And then I'm gonna create a new folder again, add a mask to it, and copy that, duplicate that normal map here. I'm just gonna drag it in to that folder. And again, I have to press Ctrl I on that folder here. And I want to scale it down a bit more here so that this looks really fine. Gonna confirm that with Enter and do the same thing over here where we have the other piece. And that would be this one. Just gonna do the same thing here with the path tool. Let's create a path for it and then a selection. New folder and mask, and I'm gonna already invert that mask. And I want to just take the same normal map that we just scaled to the right amount, Ctrl J, and I'm gonna drag it in here and just bring it down here. Going to confirm that with Enter and make sure that our UV grid here is deselected. So all we have is our actual normal map together with this overlay information. And I'm gonna go here to Save As and save it as a targa and overwrite that normal map that we just exported earlier. Gonna replace that and say OK to that. And back in Substance Painter, we want to make sure that we are here in the Texture tab. And I'm just gonna bring our folder here with our fresh normal map and I'm gonna drag it into that texture shelf here. And from here I'm going to drag it over to our additional map slot. And now we have our actual texture here. And this old normal map here we can get rid of by going to File and say Clean. And it will tell us that it will remove everything that's not used currently. And now you see that old normal map disappeared and we are basically ready to go here with Substance Painter. Now, if you are familiar with my free grenade tutorial, you may find some of the things that I'm going to tell you now already familiar. I just want to make sure I cover it for people that haven't watched it. And in case that you already know your ways around with Substance Painter, you may just skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to talk about the layers and the fill layers and also about the smart materials and how we're going to make some use of those things. So whenever we are done baking a scene in Substance Painter, you will find a fresh layer here on top of the layer hierarchy, which by the way resembles Photoshop in a lot of ways. And what this empty layer enables us to do is to use our paintbrush to actually paint multiple information on it. So according here to whatever we have in our brush selected, we can then just go ahead and paint on our object. And we can also use any of these materials here that Substance Painter comes with and paint that information on there. So for instance, the bricks here come with color, height, roughness, metal, and AO because these are our actual channels that we defined before we were baking. And we can now go ahead and paint some bricks on that AK if we want. And it will do just exactly that here with all these channels at the same time, so we don't have to go through there and do it individually. And we can also deselect some of these channels if you want to. So if you click here on any of that, it will automatically slide down here to the material where we can say we don't want to paint with the height and we don't want to paint with the roughness, and we just want to be left with our AO and our color. And now you see how it's all flat. And of course you can do that with any of these materials here. So that would be basically one way of painting information onto our object individually. In most cases that is not very straightforward, so I'm just going to delete that layer. And I will introduce you to the fill layer here. What the fill layer does is that we can change a few settings. A fresh fill layer just comes with very basic information here where we can define, for example, our color, and we can change our roughness, make it super glossy or make it super matte. And we can also fill it with actual materials as the name suggests. So for example, if we go back to our bricks here, it will just apply it to the whole selection here because we don't have any mask information on it yet. We can also make use of a lot of these properties here in the actual material that overrides our base material or the base fill layer that we had. And we can then just see whatever these materials come with here as individual settings. And one thing that they always have in common is these parameters here for the fill, where we can, for example, change our tiling, and we can change the offset here, and we can also play around with the rotation. And that makes it very easy to change things around, like change an existing material to a certain look that we like and almost make it unrecognizable, so we can really have an individual look on our stuff that we work on. And for the case that you really happen to like one particular material that you applied a lot of changes to and you want to save it for another project, you can always right click here on the material setting and say create material preset, and then it will pop up here with I think a default name, and you can just rename it then and call it whatever you want and just reuse it anytime. One thing that makes Substance Painter very special is that most of these materials, if not all, I'm not 100% sure, are procedural, which means they have been created in Substance Designer. And that means that they are very flexible when it comes to the actual settings. Like all these different parameters here allow us to add extra dirt to it or crank up some scratches on it. And like I said before, that makes it really simple to change an existing look and get something that fits exactly our reference image that we want to tune our texture towards. So now we learned about the layers and the fill layers, and the next thing are the smart materials here, which we can access by clicking on that button, or we can just browse over here to the smart materials tab and then just select any of these elements here and drag them on top of our layer hierarchy. The reason why we have to do that is that it's not like the fill layer where we just click on it and it will automatically appear, because these things here always come in a folder made out of a whole lot of actions that together make the smart material. And it's always a good idea to see how they actually have been built by just deselecting everything down to the base. So for instance, here we have the bronze at the very bottom, and then we have the dirt on top and even more dirt. some details here. And it's very interesting to see how they build these things. Very often I create a smart material and I just want to use a certain action here that they already applied to one specific layer here. And you can then just take it and drag it into another folder. So it's not always essential to just use the whole smart material as it is. We can always also go into our settings again here and change that around. Give it a different look. And let's say we really like one thing, then again, it's really easy to save it out and reuse it later by right-clicking the folder and say create smart material. And that will pop up then down here as a new smart material, and we can just give it a different name and then again reuse it for any other object that we want to bring into Substance Painter. And since we already have a very good example here with that smart material, I want to show you one thing that is absolutely essential to our workflow for as soon as we start with the actual texturing. These edges here are based on a black mask that is applied to our fill layer and work in combination with so-called generators. These generators look at our curvature information and ambient occlusion and sometimes also other support maps that we baked out earlier. And in those settings here, we can then change the look around as well and define a very specific wear and tear look to our object. So this basically is one of the most important tools that we have here with Substance Painter, and we can make an absolutely amazing texture with it in record time. We can always also add more generators on top. So let's say I want to have the dripping rust, which probably won't look good, but just to showcase it. And by adding that, it automatically overrides the one that's below, unless we put that here from normal to screen. And now it actually blends with whatever we have below. And that again gives us a whole set of options to make that look very specific to what we want it to be. We can also put it to multiply, which will then take away from the information and not combine it. And again, a whole lot of options worth just testing them out and see what works. And I would say that we are done with the introduction part and we can actually start on our texture here for the AK. And for that, I want to be working in our wood first. Both the stock and our hand guards here get the same kind of wood. And I want to have this kind of look here. Of course, you can feel free to change it to any color that you want, but I like this specific deep red tone here, almost a little neon looking, very saturated. And also one thing that I want to definitely have is this kind of effect here. I'm trying to mimic that as much as possible. And for that, we're gonna make use of a procedural wood material. Substance Painter already comes with it. It's called Wood American Cherry. However, I wasn't quite happy with the result when I compared it to the specific texture reference that I want to achieve here. And that meant for me that I went into Substance Designer and I opened the default Substance file for that wood. And as you can see, it's a little complicated and it took me quite a while to get it to a point where I actually like it. And you can grab it out of the Essentials folder as well. I'm gonna demonstrate it here. I'm gonna just say File and import Substance into Project and say Wood American Cherry AKM. So now we have the same wood in here, but with a few modifications on it to make it look a little nicer in certain aspects. And I also exposed a few parameters on it to give us more control over the individual look of the wood. And what exactly all that means, I'm going to show you next. First of all, I'm going to delete those test layers that we have here. I'm just going to leave the AO. And I will go ahead by creating a folder, and I'm going to call it wood. And into that folder, I want to create our subfolders, and I'm going to go ahead here with the stock first of all. And into that, I will drop a fill layer here, which if you want, you can also give a proper name. Always good to keep it all properly named to find it later. And now with that fill layer selected, I'm going to click here on our modified wood. And what this procedural material here allows us to do is that when we press F3 and have a look at it in the 2D mode, just going to cycle here by pressing C over to our base color, you can see how the texture actually looks like. It has these layers here, those wood rings. And in between, it just has like horizontal lines that tile perfectly here from left to right. Everything is tileable, by the way. And what we want to do is to make these layers here match our actual reference by tweaking these values until it gives us the look that we want to have. Again, if I press C, I can also cycle here through the rest of our channels. And when you press M, you get back into our actual material mode where everything is combined together. This material here comes with a whole lot of different parameters to choose from. And the ones that we really want are, first of all, the height information. Like you can see how that looks nothing like what we want it to look like. So I'm going to bring down the height range here. And I really want it to look polished. We will add wear and tear later, but for now I'm just going to go ahead here and make it look as close to that here in terms of its actual roughness. And as far as our pattern is concerned, I'm going to, just to mention it again, try to mimic these layers here that we see. And for that, I'm happy having the height information here at 0.02, very subtle. We can still see a little bit of it, but we don't want it to look super bumpy. So I'm just gonna have it there. And here comes a nice example of what makes it a procedural material. If you have a look at these knots here, I actually don't want to have them. All the reference images that I had a look at don't have these knots in the wood. So I'm just gonna disable it entirely here, bring it to 0. And you can see how it just disappeared magically. That's because we are not looking at a photo texture as it was in the old days. And that also means that we can scale it up and down without quality loss. And before I go ahead with anything else here, I want to put that into an actual masked folder. So I will click here on our stock folder and add a black mask to it. And that will make the whole object basically disappear. What we have to do to get it back is to go to the geometry decal. And I will choose the mesh selection here. And that's basically like the element mode in 3D Max. If we click on our object, it will just make a selection for this thing here. And now we can see that we have more selected than we actually want. Like this part here is not a separate element. So that means that we have to go here into our polygon selection and put that slider here to black and deselect it from that mask. You can see how it reveals our old material. And speaking of which, we will work on the metal later, but it would still be good to already have like a base here under the wood that is actually black, just so that we get a better sense for what we're doing. And I just added a fill layer here and adjusted the color and the roughness in order to get that. So now we get a better idea how we want to tweak our material here when we look at our reference images. And I want to be doing exactly that as the next thing, going back here into our actual wood material, and I want to change the UV scale, the UV offset, as well as the rotation until we actually get that pattern here, those layers to appear where we want them. And for that, I'm going to break that uniform scale here by clicking on that symbol. And now we can scale both horizontally and vertically with individual settings. So just to quickly demonstrate that, we can scale it vertically here, and we can do the same thing horizontally here. And as you can see, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we want to keep these settings as low as possible in the region somewhere around its original scale, which is 1 by 1. And chances are that your unwrap is different to mine. So these values here need its individual tweaking until we get what we really want here in terms of having the pattern in place. As for my unwrap, I already made a test earlier where I tweaked these parameters until I liked it. So I know that I want to have the UV offset at -4 free, and vertically I want it to be 8.2. And I want to have this here at 158. Very precise values, but that's just what it takes to get that kind of look here. And I also want to change the UV rotation to 1.5 so that this pattern here is really where we want it to be. As the next thing, I want to be working on the color, and I want it to be a red tone. So I can either do it here through the actual options, which would be the normal way to do it, or you could also do the following thing, which is a pretty cool feature that Substance Painter has. You can just select any pixel out of the software itself by just dragging the color picker on it, and that already gives us a certain look here that kind of matches this material here. Sometimes it takes a little bit of actually getting the tone quite right here, since it's always just looking at one pixel and then blends it into the whole object here. And then usually it's a matter of tweaking it a little bit more. Gonna bring the light intensity down here and maybe a bit more. Add a bit more saturation. And also I want to increase our contrast here. And now it has this nice and gloomy look that I like here on that reference. We can also change our roughness. The roughness luminosity here will do exactly that. If we put it all the way here to white, it will become very glossy. Sometimes this is inverted, so don't be confused about it. In that case here, we have to slide it to white and it becomes all glossy. So usually it's really just a matter of seeing what works for us. For example, I quite like this amount here. Don't want to have it too polished looking, but just the right amount. And as for our contrast, we can also play around with that here. But I'm actually quite liking how it was. And another thing we could do is to add some more fibers to it. It's quite interesting here. You can see how we get a little bit of this extra fiber noise in there. And we can also enhance that here with the light intensity. Gonna crank that up a bit. Not too strong, gonna have it here 0.2. And also keep in mind, right now we're looking at it here in 2K. So it's a good idea to also switch over to 4K from time to time. and see if we still like what we're producing. And that certainly looks very sharp and crisp, just how we want it to be. So in order for that to not be super slow, I'm just gonna go straight back here to 2K. It's just important to do that from time to time so that we actually still like what we're producing as a final result. But it would otherwise be too slow to keep working in 4K, as nice as it would be. And as for our wood here, I'm already starting to like what I see here. It's a nice base. You can also see we get some height information here, which by the way equals the normal map in Substance Painter. So for the case that you've been wondering why we don't have a normal map channel here, that's exactly what the height information stands for. So deselecting that, you can see how we get absolutely nothing here. Putting it back on will basically give us our height, which then converts into our normal map later when we export our texture. And speaking of normal map, sometimes the actual material only gives us so much information here in our height. But what if we want to add a bit more to it? Like for example, I want to have this fiber look here a little bit finer. So in that case, we need to have a detail normal map that's blending over our original material. And I can do exactly that by creating a fill layer here on top of it. I'm gonna add a black mask to it. And onto that black mask, I'm gonna add a so-called fill. Now what the fill enables us to do is to add a procedural texture to it here on the left side on the shelf. And I'm gonna search for fiber. And I wanna take the wood fiber as one. I'm gonna drag it into the grayscale slot here. And I'm gonna make use of the rotation. I'm gonna put it around 90. So that these fibers go here horizontally. And as the next thing, I'm going back into our original material here, and I will disable everything that we have other than the height information. I want to keep the height, and now we can actually increase the height quite dramatically, as you can see here, based on our procedural texture that we have here in our fill. And I can also change the individual looks of that if we want. So for example, the histogram position will give it a bit of a random noise, and the contrast will make it a little random as well here. But from what I've seen on the reference image, I mostly want to keep it all over the place, and I also want to tile it up a bit more. So let's see what it looks like here with 3 times 3. Definitely too strong now here in terms of our actual height. So I'm going back here to the original material and again adjust the height on it. And also always a good idea to toggle through it to see if we really like it. And that is definitely better than before. It's representing more what I'm seeing on the reference image. Now the other thing that I want to add here on top of our wood material is a bit of these bright color blotches that I see here all over the place. Give it a bit more of a saturation. We already have it here in a few selected areas, but it looks too perfect. And I want to get a bit of a random color noise in there. And for that, I'm going to make use of the same technique, create a fill layer, and I'm going to turn the color to something between orange and yellow. Make sure it's saturated, and I will add a black mask and again a fill, and I'm gonna add another wood fiber in here. Gonna change the rotation around. And now I'm gonna make use here of our histogram position. Also add a bit of contrast. And now I'm gonna turn that here into saturation mode. And you can already see we have a bit more of this randomness in here now. And I also want to bring the UV scale down to, let's say, 0.2. And not to forget, I only want to work with the color here, so I'm gonna disable the roughness and the metalness and the AO, all these things that we don't need, so that we really are left here with the color only. And now it already looks better to me. It's giving us a bit of this intense color. And that definitely adds a little bit here to it. And now that I look at it, actually I quite liked it with the tiling a little higher. So I'm gonna put that here to 0.6. And that gives us a bit more of a variation here. And you might have noticed that we have these little screws here, which we actually don't want to be wood. So we're gonna fix that later once we start working on the metal. For now, I'm just gonna continue here with the other objects that require wood, and that would be our hand guards. So I'm gonna duplicate that folder here. You can right click it and say duplicate layer, which will actually make a duplicate of the folder as well, or you can just press Ctrl and D. So with that wood here copied, I'm just gonna override our mask by saying add black mask. And I'm going back here into our geometry decal. And with the white color, I'm just gonna select it here for this element. And I gotta make sure I'm not in polygon selection, but in mesh selection. So now we have it also here on the handguard. And I'm gonna call it handguard down. And I'm gonna make another copy and I'm gonna call it handguard up. And do the same thing here, add a black mask and just select this one here. And now it's just a matter of getting the offset right here on that pattern. I want to have these layers more here in the center on the top. And for that, I'm just going back here into the actual material and I will adjust the vertical offset on it. And here we have it. 0.25 seems to do a great job. Definitely happy with that. See if we can change it here horizontally a slight amount. And we still see some of these horizontal lines, which I quite like. It's on both sides. But most importantly, we have this nice pattern here on top when we look at it from that perspective. And I'm just going to go ahead here and also adjust the other handguard. And for that, let's make sure we're in the right folder here. And let's also adjust our offset amounts. Let's see if we can actually change our wood ring parameters as well. So I'm gonna crank that up here a bit, the actual scale on them, a bit more even, and lower the opacity. Let's see what's happening then. And actually it looked better before, so I'm gonna put that here to 0.5. And I may also want to change the height range a slight amount. I'm going to put it down to 0.01. And I want to do the same thing here on the upper handguard. Also put the height down to 0.01. And I'm quite happy with that look here overall for our wood. We're going to add more to it later, especially wear and tear. And once we have our metal applied to it, as well as our plastic here, and have the final composition, we can always go back and adjust these values really quickly, as you can see. It just took a bit of effort here in the beginning to get all the tiling and the offset right, but now that we have that in place, it's really straightforward to change it further down the road. And now it's time to add the metal to our scene. Gonna create a new folder, call it metal all. And as usual, I'm gonna drop a fill layer into it, and I will choose the parkerized steel material. The first thing that I want to do on that is to lower our height range. I'm going to put it to 0.01. And I want to put the tiling up to, let's say, 5. And I also want to change our color on it. I'm going to bring it down here to 0.2. And also you want to make it a little glossier. So you can just change it here. On that material, as you can see, we have to actually drag it into the dark region here in order to make it glossier. On the wood, it was reverse. So let's leave it somewhere around here, 0.4. Looks pretty good. And now I just want to bring our wood back. Gonna create a white mask this time, because it's actually easier to just deselect everything that is not metal than having to go through each element and say you're metal, you're metal, you're metal here. So I will just take the geometry decal again in combination here with the mesh selection. And with that slider here put to dark, I will go ahead here and modify our mask. Gonna select this and this thing here, same as this. And also here our bolt carrier is actually not parkerized steel, so I'm gonna have a different material for it later. Also select it here. And also the pistol grip is made out of plastic, so I'm gonna also deselect that. And one thing that I almost forgot is that here at the bottom of the stock, we have this element here, and I will go into the base color mode to make it a bit more visible. And I will change it here to the UV mode, and with the white selection here, just click in there and it will make that metal. Like this is actually supposed to be a metal element. And also these pieces here, I also want them to be part of the metal, so we'll switch over here to the polygon selection and make sure I grab all these elements here as well. Right now they're taking the black here from that material that we created earlier. If I uncheck that, it becomes a bit more obvious. So now we have everything here on the stock so far. Let's zoom in here. And that seems to be fine. Just gonna switch that back on here for now. We will replace that later with the proper materials. And since we are already working here on the metal, I also want to address these elements here that are currently showing as wood, where in reality we want it also to be metal. Gonna switch over here to the 2D mode and zoom in on these elements. Let's try to get close. And with the current brush selected, I'm gonna change the hardness, crank it all the way up here and bring it down to fit exactly that space. And I want to make sure that I'm actually painting with white, since we want to affect our black mask here. And then I'm just gonna stamp in there, and if you wonder why that didn't quite work, it's because I forgot to put the size space here to viewport. So now I just have to rearrange the brush size, and now we have a perfect selection here for these elements. I'm gonna press F to jump out and zoom back in here. The zoom doesn't really zoom exactly where I want it to zoom. That's why I'm having this fight here. Again F. And let's not forget we also have these elements here. And let's not forget that we also have these elements here, which are also screws, and we want to make sure that they are also metal. So I'm just gonna mask that here. And let's zoom out. We have two more of these cases. One here on the stock, which I forgot earlier. So I'm just gonna do the same thing here. Mask that. And then we have this element here on our pistol stock that we also want to have as a metal screw in there. And let me have a look. Seems like we have everything added to it. And that, as far as I can see, basically concludes our metal mask here. And the next thing that I want to do is first of all give that here a proper name. Base metal. And I'm gonna duplicate that layer. I will call it base metal magazine. One of the things that I see on a whole lot of pictures is that the magazine tends to have a brighter metal tone. Not only here in that movie, but also on actual references like this one here. And I just want to add a mask to it here. Select the magazine and go ahead, change the color, make it a little brighter. And coming to think of it, I also want to do the same thing here on the upper receiver. There are also enough references where I see that being a little brighter, and it just adds a little bit of a variety in here so that it's not all the same kind of blackness. And I will just go over here, mesh selection again, and pick our upper receiver for that. Now, one thing to be aware of when duplicating a layer like we just did is that our height information on it multiplies, or you could say overlays, with the one that we have under it. So if I deselect this layer here again, you will see how that grain here becomes a little less obvious. And that means that I just want to go in here and disable our height for it, because I was happy with the amount that we had here globally, and I don't want to change that around to appear different. And let me zoom out. The last piece that's missing is the bolt carrier, and I want to add it back into the folder here. I made a mistake earlier thinking that it would be good to have it separated, and that's because I want it to appear different here. I want to give it also a bit of a contrast by making that here more of a pure metal tone. But we can also just leave it here in the same folder, and I want to make use of a smart material for it. I'm gonna use the steel, drag that here into our metal folder. I'm gonna give it a different name and call it steel bolt carrier. And I want to, of course, give it a mask. And I don't want it to appear that bright. That would stand out too much. So I will lower the opacity here on the base color. Bring it down to, let's say, somewhere around 30. So now we have almost all our base materials assigned to the AK. What's missing is the pistol grip. And I found that reference image here that I want to copy in terms of its look. I really like that noise here. this specific pattern that makes it very interesting. And I want to make use of our plastic glossy smart material, which I'm going to drag on top of our layer hierarchy here. And I'm going to mask it as usual with a mesh selection. And now I'll make use of this method that we used earlier by just taking the color picker here and drag it over here to my secondary monitor until I like the look of the color that I want to use for it. And I'm gonna have a look at the rest of the layers that they put in here. So the plastic variation seems to give it some different roughness along the edges, which definitely makes it look nice. And the bump could be used to simulate this look here. What we need to do that is to get our color back. So I'm going to check that here. I'm going to put it into the overlay mode and bring it down. Maybe bring it up again a bit. And also I want to tile that here. Let's give it a 1.5. Oh, let's try it with 2. And now you can see we already get exactly this kind of an effect here. Actually, it looks really flat. I don't see any bump on there at all. So what I'm going to do is disable the height on it. And that leaves us only with this interesting noise here. So even though that looks pretty glossy here, I don't think it's really that extreme. So I'm going to go here into our plastic base and bring the roughness down somewhere around here. Maybe a little glossier again. I'm going to go back here into that bump and make it a bit more intense. So now we're really left with this plastic noise that we see on the reference. So as the next thing, I want to be working on our wear and tear for the metal. And before I actually go ahead and start working on it properly, I just want to explain the actual way that we would approach that. So since we have our very pristine metal base here now, the next logical thing would be to then add some edge wear, like damages and scratches that form up around our curves here. And for that we would create a new fill layer and go over here to our materials and choose any of these steel types here. For example, that one. And then in combination with our black mask and any of our generators, we can then start getting some serious effects here that we also have control over. And usually the first look reveals anything that's wrong with it. So for example, we see that this thing here should actually go in and not come out. So in order to change that, we can jump back to our base material here and change our height position. And it's really subtle values usually that affect that. So turning it down here will actually make it go in, and turning it anything above 5 will pop it out even more. So usually I just leave it somewhere around here, 4.9. And we can also change around our height range itself, which will also impact that. So we would tweak these values here until we're actually happy with it. The height range is depending on our height position, which is why right now we would have to find the right amount again. And usually I don't want to have it super bumpy to begin with. So something like that here would already be fine for me. And now we could also go into that actual metal material that we have shining through here and affect, for example, our roughness. So if we turn that all the way down, it would start looking pretty bad, but somewhere around here would then give it a bit of a contrast to our actual parkerized steel that we have here. And again, the generators have the parameters that we want to change for that in order to achieve a specific look. So something like that here maybe. Make it a little glossier again. And we can also add more generators on top of that by right-clicking on our black mask. So let's say we want to have the mask builder, which is a very powerful one. We could add this one. And that will override the one that we have below. In order to blend it, we're gonna have to put it to screen mode. So now we have these effects here under our mask builder, and they actually blend with each other. And another thing that we could add on top of these two generators here, in order to pop it out a bit more, is to add a filter such as the sharpen filter here. So that will just help it stand out a bit more, give it a bit more contrast overall. And again, if that's too strong, we can always change the intensity on it. So usually it's a good idea to not have it on its default value, but actually give it a subtle tweak until we like it. And of course we can add as many fill layers to our scene as we want and make use of different materials for it. So for example here the dirt, I could use a different generator for it, such as the dirt modifier itself here, which really lives up to its name, as you can see. And again, we can just tweak these values here until we like them. Change our grunge amount. Just play with these parameters here till we get a certain look that we like. And as you can see, these are just two layers here in combination with our masks and generators, and we already have a whole different looking AK in front of us. So very powerful tools for us to texture our objects. So as the next thing, I'm gonna start working on the wear and tear properly. And for that, I'm gonna first of all delete those layers that we don't want. And I want to copy our metal folder here, Control and D. And I'm gonna call that metal edge wear. And I will delete everything that's inside. That leaves us with just the mask that we want, because earlier we already defined properly what's metal and what not. So within that folder, we can now go ahead and work with a particular smart material, which already comes with certain generators applied to it. So creating that, all I have to do is drop it in our masked folder here, so that we don't have it affecting our wood and plastic. And now I also want to delete the actual metal base, because we already defined that with our parkerized steel. So we'll delete that. And this material already comes with two fill properties applied to it within our edgeware. So the first one here makes use of the moisture noise for both the height and the roughness. And the second one adds some film dust to it. If we toggle that, we can see that it adds a bit more variation here to our scene. And that's definitely good to keep. I want to change the height range though. I'm going to bring it down to 0.01 and the height position I'm going to put it to 4.9 so that it doesn't look super deep here. And let's also have a look in our mask. They already added the edge wear modifier or generator and the sharpen filter on top. So first of all, I'm gonna bring the sharpen amount down to 0.2. And at the moment, this is way too strong here for my taste. I'm gonna change those properties here for the metal edge wear as well. And first of all, I'm gonna bring the grunge amount down to 0. The wear level, I'm gonna have it at 3.5. I also don't want to have a whole lot of contrast on it, so I'm gonna bring it down to 0. Crank up the edge smoothness around 7, maybe a little less, 6.5. And as for our curvature weight, I'm gonna put it to 0.6. So now we have a nicer look, like that would be the first base here for our wear and tear that we can build more on top. And for that, I'm gonna add another generator. Gonna make use of the edge damages. And I want to have the sharpen modifier on top of everything. So right clicking it and move to top will do that. As for our edge damages, I'm gonna bring the level down to somewhere around here, 0.3. And the contrast, I also wanna have it a bit stronger. So I'm gonna put it around here. And the overall intensity, I'm just gonna slightly increase it. And most importantly, I'm gonna put that here to screen mode so that it actually blends. And that already starts looking pretty interesting here. I'm gonna add another generator. Again, let's bring the sharpen on top. And this one, I'm gonna make use of the mask builder, which is a very powerful one. And within those properties, first of all, I'm gonna bring the level down to 0.05. I'm gonna take the grunge amount all the way down to 0. And now I'm gonna scroll down here. And I wanna put the smoothness up to 5 here for our curvature. Let's give it an exact value here. So basically, if you wonder where everything went, the reason why I did that is because really all that I want is make use of these scratch properties that we have here. So I'm gonna have that somewhere around here, crank the intensity up, as well as our scale. And now you can see we have these nice scratches all over the place. Well, actually not all over the place, but in a few selected areas. And that just adds a little bit of an extra touch here to the whole thing. But as always, we want to make sure we have it in screen mode so that it actually blends. And that would be pretty good here for our upper receiver part. So what I will do is double click that original smart material folder here, and I'm going to call it upper receiver. And I will add a mask to it and go over here to our geometry decal and just apply it here to the upper receiver. And also, let's add it here to our actual stock end, which also needs some wear and tear. So I'm gonna go back here and just select everything that we have here at the back. Quite liking that. So as a next thing, what I will do is duplicate that layer. First of all, I'm gonna call that here upper receiver and stock end. And now I'm just gonna take our duplicate here and I will call it receiver. Overwrite our mask here and just make a selection for the actual receiver part. And now I also want to go into these individual settings and give them a tweak here until we're happy with it. And as for our mask builder, I'm already quite liking that. Let's leave those scratches where they are. And as for our edge damages, I'm gonna bring the level up to a higher amount, somewhere around here looks fine. And as for our metal edge wear, I want to put the grunge amount up a bit, 0.5, and also our actual wear level, I'm going to crank it up here to almost 1. Gonna add more wear contrast to it. Lower our edge smoothness. Gonna increase the grunge scale all the way up so we have this really fine pattern there. And I'm gonna bring our curvature weight down to somewhere around here. So now we're left with this nice flaky metal that I'm quite liking. Maybe it's a little too contrasty, so I'm gonna disable the sharpen on it. So next I'm gonna take that exact folder here from our receiver part, I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm gonna call it safety switch. Override the mask again and select our safety switch here. And that requires some more tweaking again, so I will go in our properties here, and within our edge wear I'm gonna have to adjust the wear level here. I'm gonna have it at 7.5, looks okay. And as for our edge damages intensity, that looks way too strong. I'm gonna have the level down at somewhere around here, looks fine. And I'm quite liking the decent amount of wear that we have on that piece here. So I'm gonna also add it here to our trigger elements. Go over to the mask and mesh select this piece here as well as our trigger. As for our screws here, I'm gonna make a separate folder and add all of them in there and tweak the levels until they look good for these small elements. And for that I'm gonna copy our receiver again. Gonna call that screws. Override our black mask again. And also I'm gonna say here to the safety switch trigger, just so that we remember which parts are found in which folder. So now what we have to do is go into our screws folder here. We go over here into that perspective, and let's just select everything here that is a screw. Right now the wear and tear is still way too strong on it, so I'm gonna adjust that in a moment. For now it's just a matter of selecting everything. And this one we can also add to it. And we could probably also add this little element here, as well as over here we could add these parts to it already. And let's also add this one, small element. So we'll go out of this selection mode here, back into our paint mode, and start adjusting these generators. And first of all, I want to disable the mask builder. As for our edge damages, gonna bring the level down to 4, gonna increase the contrast on it. And as for our metal edge wear generator, I'm gonna lower the edge wear around 0.6, and now you can see we have some decent looking wear here on that, and it's not completely taking away from all our parkerized steel coating that we have on top. So let me have a look around here. These two elements don't have any edge wear on it yet, so I will add that to our screws folder as well here. Which we already defined to look good on smaller objects, and it definitely works within that folder. As the next thing, I'm gonna work here on the rear side. So I will copy the upper receiver for it, override our black mask, and I will add the rear side to it. I'm gonna add more edge wear to that here later. If I would do that now, it would be way too strong because our curvature information sometimes has issues with this super cylindrical unwraps. So if I add that now, let me show you what happens. So basically it's turning into pure metal and we still want to have some coating on top. I'm gonna take care of that later. Let's have a look around. I forgot to add this part here to our trigger element. But first of all, let me give that here also a proper name. Rear side. And while I'm still in the rear side folder, actually I also want to add these elements to it. So let me just select them as well. And back to that piece here, gonna switch back to our folder where we already have the trigger in. I'm gonna add this as well. So as a next thing, I want to be working on our magazine. I'm gonna copy the receiver for it. Give it a proper name here without a typo. And I'm gonna override our mask again. Pick the magazine. And the first thing that we can already see quite clearly is that it's way too strong in terms of wear. So I will go into the individual parameters, and first of all I'm just going to disable the first two here at the bottom. And as for our grunge amount, I want to actually turn it up a bit, have some more of these chips appearing. Gonna put the scale amount up to 3. And as for our edge damages, which definitely makes the most noise here on our magazine, I'm gonna bring the level down to a reasonable amount. Also gonna bring the intensity down a bit. And the other thing that I also want to do is bring our metal intensity itself down on that generator. And for that we can switch over here to the metalness and lower the opacity on it. So I'm gonna have it around 60. And as for our metal edge wear itself here, I'm gonna replace the ambient occlusion with our thickness map. And that basically just means that we have less white information in there because our thickness map has a whole lot of dark tones. So that just makes it a bit less intense here on our magazine and is exactly the kind of thing that I would like to have there. I'm gonna bring the grunge scale down on it and I'm gonna adjust our curvature weight. Actually, I rather want to turn it down as well. Have it around here. And our overall wear level, I'm gonna have it around 0.6. And as for our grunge amount, I'm gonna crank it up a bit. And that makes for a pretty nice magazine. The last thing I'm gonna do is add our sharpen filter back on. Earlier we already put it to 0.2 here, the parameter. And I think we can leave it right there. We don't need to crank that up even more. Just adds a bit more contrast to the scene. Now I almost forgot to switch that here back to base color, which is basically the default mode that Painter works in. So I want to make sure this is turned back. And next I want to be working here on our barrel, the whole barrel region here. And for that I'm gonna make a copy of our, actually the upper receiver. So I'm gonna copy that. And as usual, add a black mask. And select our barrel element. And this one sure looks like it needs some adjustments to it. It's one of these cases where we have our cylindrical curvature here doing some wild things here with a curvature map. So first of all, I want to disable our edge damages on it. And I'm also gonna toggle off the edge wear for now and just concentrate here on the mask builder. And I wanna bring the global curvature intensity down. Gonna have it here at 0.9. And as for our metal edge wear, I'm gonna bring the curvature weight down first of all. That has the biggest impact here. Gonna leave it at 0.4. That still leaves us with a bit of this edge highlights, which is exactly what we want to keep. And as for the other parameters, I'm gonna increase the wear level to 0.4, put our contrast up to 0.6. As for our edge smoothness, I'm gonna bring it down a bit. And other than that, that looks pretty good to me. Now, another thing that we could add to that mask is this piece here and the one here in the inside, so that we also have a bit of edge wear here on these elements. And also, I'm looking at these two cap elements here, and I feel like they could need a bit of extra edge wear on it. So what I'm gonna do is take our upper receiver again, add a black mask, and I won't be using the mesh selection for it. Instead, I'm gonna use here our UV chunk selection. So I'm gonna go zoom in there and click these elements here so that we get a bit of extra wear on them. The reason why I'm using the UV mode here for that is because this is all one element and I don't want to add these elements to it right now, or else that would be turning all into metal again. And I forgot to give these layers here a proper name. The current one, I'm just gonna call it metal caps. And as for this one here, that was our barrel elements. Now, as for our front side here and that gas block, I feel like they could need a bit of extra wear. So I'm gonna copy our metal caps and I will call that front side and gas block. As always, override it. And I will go into our UV selection mode, zoom in on these faces, and make sure I only select the elements that we really want to have here. Also gonna add that thing here, the needle. Also gonna add this element here to it. And as for our gas block, I also want to add some of these faces, or actually all of them. And I'm gonna adjust the generators on them. Most importantly here on the edge damages, I'm gonna bring the contrast up all the way to 0.9, as well as our damage intensity. I'm gonna almost double it. And I also wanna crank our overall level up here. Gonna leave it at 3.7. And as for our edge wear modifier, gonna bring the wear level down and maybe give the curvature weight here a slight adjustment. And that should cover it for our first chapter of the Substance Painter part. We're gonna continue that in part 2, and in that part we will take it all the way to the finishing line. I'll see you there.